Welcome to Christianity and Culture in the Early Church, or as I like to call it, the Roman History course, because this course is all about the historical context of the New Testament and the early church. And I believe very strongly that one cannot study the early church or the New Testament in any depth without also understanding the historical, social, political, and cultural context in the Roman Empire. Now, if you've seen Star Wars, you already know something about the Roman Empire, because the political background in the Star Wars movies, and especially the ones that came out in the 1970s, are all based on Roman history. So, just like in the world of Star Wars, Rome was a republic first, ruled by senators, and these senators would gather in the Senate, and every year they would elect two of the senators to be the primary senators called consuls. The consuls were elected annually, and there were two at a time, and they rotated. But eventually, one of those senators became an emperor, and the republic became an empire. Now, I'm going to say up front, there are a couple of things that you need to keep in mind throughout all of this. And first is the watershed event, which is the rise of Constantine as the first Christian emperor. And eventually we'll get around to talking about that and what that means that he was the first Christian emperor. But most of this course will actually be about the time period before Constantine became emperor and before he legalized Christianity. The point is that everything changes when Christianity becomes legalized. And I don't mean to imply that it's all bad. Some people like to say that Constantine and the legalization of Christianity was the worst thing that could have happened to the church. And that's not really true. There were good things that came out of the conversion of the empire, like the creation of the weekend and the discontinuance of certain blood sports and inhumane forms of execution, like crucifixion, and eventually slavery itself, almost. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The other thing you need to keep in mind is the influence of Greek culture, because the Roman Empire actually spoke the near universal language of Greek until about the 1st century, right? And then only in the West did it shift to Latin, and the church used Greek as its official language even in the West until the 3rd century. So Greek culture has a huge influence on the Roman Empire and on the church, and there's enough of that in the introductory course, History 1, to set you up to understand this. And so if you don't remember that stuff, go back to the textbook, reading the Church Fathers, and read what you highlighted or underlined in the textbook, or reread those early chapters. Now, basically, educated Roman people would be expected to be at least bilingual. In fact, they did not have interpreters in the Senate, so senators were expected to speak at least Greek and Latin. And when it comes to someone like Jesus and his apostles living in the Hebrew world, well, he would have known Hebrew, and they would speak Aramaic on a daily basis. And though I'm not an expert on Semitic languages, as I understand it, Aramaic is kind of street Hebrew. In other words, analogous to the way Latin evolves into Italian, Hebrew in everyday language evolved into Aramaic. And you Semitic scholars can correct me if I'm wrong about that. But the point is that Jesus and the apostles would have spoken and read Hebrew. They would have spoken Aramaic. They would have spoken Greek fluently. They would be able to write Greek pretty well, because you can't really conduct business. You know, if you're a fisherman, you got to sell your fish, right? So they would be able to write in Greek pretty well, as we can see from the New Testament documents. And they could probably get by speaking some Latin, but maybe they couldn't read it or write it. Now, finally, I want to mention colonialism, because the Roman Empire is, after all, an empire. And colonialism will come to the Holy Land where Christianity is born. But I want to clarify, not all evangelization is colonialism. Even when the evangelization accompanies colonialism, it's not necessarily a bad thing that people are converted to Christianity. I mean, to use a slightly more recent example, right? The invasion and subjugation and enslavement of indigenous peoples, that's a bad thing. The conversion of indigenous peoples to Christianity, well, that's a good thing. And it's only doing what Jesus told his followers to do, which is to disciple all the nations. And so you need to keep those two things separate in your mind. We will confront colonialism in the context of the spread of the gospel, right? And the spread of the gospel, if we're Christians, that's a good thing. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into the history of the Roman Republic before the empire. But what you need to know is that the Republic had literally just become an empire when Jesus was born. Kind of like how in Star Wars, the Republic had just become an empire when Luke and Leia Skywalker were born, right? And so somewhere around 50 years or so before Jesus was born, there was a Roman senator called Julius Caesar. Now, maybe you heard of him. He was, of course, among the wealthiest families in Rome, and in the Roman Empire, what wealthy families did was they used their money to pay for the building of large buildings and monuments so that they could put their names on them. The buildings could be named after them, and they would also use their money to sponsor games and shows and races and celebrate festivals and give people several days at a time off from work. And all of this was meant to make them famous. So Julius Caesar started building things. And then at one point, when he was the consul, one of the two primary senators, he got it in his head that he didn't want to give that up when his term was over. In fact, he wanted to be top dog forever. And so he used the various wars and other drama that the Romans were involved in to get himself appointed to a particular office that already existed in the Roman Empire. Now, this was an office that was meant to be temporary. It's an office that was meant to be for times of emergency only, when the crisis was so bad that the Roman Republic truly needed a single point of authority at the top of the hierarchy. They truly needed a singular leader to lead them through the crisis. But again, the point being that when the crisis was over, that person was meant to give up that office and relinquish control back to the Senate. Well, that office was called dictator, right? But the word dictator didn't have back then all the negative connotations that it has for us now, because it was Julius Caesar who gave it those negative connotations. It was Julius Caesar who invented the idea of dictator for life. And so he took for himself the title dictator, and then he tried to get the Senate to proclaim him dictator for life. And I think you know how they responded to that. In 44 BCE, they assassinated him. But in the chaos after his assassination, it became clear that somebody was going to come out on top. Somebody was going to emerge as dictator for life. In other words, somebody was going to come out of the chaos as the first emperor of Rome. And we won't worry about the details, but suffice it to say that there was a civil war, and with two sides, right? On one side, the senator Mark Antony, and he was backed by Cleopatra with all the ships of Egypt. Now, of course, they were lovers by this point. She had been with Julius Caesar. Now she's with Mark Antony. And the rumor was that if he won, he was going to move the capital of the Roman Empire to Alexandria. On the other side is Julius Caesar's great-nephew, Octavian, who is also Julius Caesar's heir because Caesar had adopted him as his son. And so Julius Caesar's great-nephew and heir, Octavian, goes to battle against Mark Antony. And the whole thing comes down to a naval battle, the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. And the winner was Caesar's nephew, Octavian. And so he became the first emperor of Rome. And spoiler alert, he's going to change his name to Augustus. So this is the Caesar Augustus that was emperor when Jesus was born. And so we can date the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire to the year 31 BC. Now let's talk about Roman citizenship. What does it mean to be a Roman citizen? Because as you know from reading the New Testament, The Apostle Paul was a Roman citizen, and you can tell that that's an important thing, and it's a privilege that not everyone has. And so let's talk about Roman citizenship. Now, most people who are inhabitants of the empire are not Roman citizens. But of those who are, there are two kinds of citizenship. The two kinds of citizenship are citizens with private rights, which is kind of a partial citizenship, and citizens with public rights, which is a full citizenship. So citizens with public rights also have private rights, right? So that's the full citizenship, right? So citizens with private rights are citizens who are considered entities under the law who can own things, right? You can own a business, you can conduct business, and this is important, you can have a legally registered marriage, because in the Roman world, a marriage is a financial contract, and we'll get back to that later. Well, then there's full citizenship, or citizenship with public rights. Citizens who have public rights also have all the private rights, but the public rights include the right to vote and to hold office. So, it's probably the case that most free people in the city of Rome, right, had at least private rights, and then some, especially in the upper classes, also had the public rights. The farther out from the city of Rome you go, the less likely it is for someone to be a citizen, or if they are a citizen, the more likely it is that they have private rights but not public rights. Immigrants, even in the city of Rome, were probably not citizens, and slaves were not citizens. Women were citizens with, assuming they could be citizens at all, women were citizens with private rights but not public rights. So women could conduct business and obviously be party to a marriage contract. Now, you probably also know this from reading the New Testament, but somehow the Apostle Paul or his family received citizenship as a reward for something, and we're not sure what. But the point is that citizenship could be given as a gift or a reward, and there were times when the Romans gave citizenship to an entire conquered nation as a way to keep them loyal. In the 1st century BCE, the inhabitants of Italy outside of Rome wanted the benefits of citizenship. So they lived in Italy, but not in the city of Rome, and they didn't have citizenship. And this actually came down to a civil war, and they won in the sense that they got citizenship. And so now, from this point on, the idea of what is a Roman is no longer just someone in the city of Rome, but someone in the whole, or from the whole Italian peninsula. And this basically created the reality of a unified Italian ethnicity. And so, from this time forward, what is considered Roman includes Italy. Okay, now, by the time of Jesus, women had not only basic private rights, but they started to acquire certain public rights in the sense that women were given the ability to inherit property from not only their own family, but from their husband's family. And so what happens is you have these situations where two very wealthy families combine, because again, that's what marriage is in the Roman context. It is a contract for the consolidation of wealth, right? Two very wealthy families combine, and basically between the natural fact that women live longer than men and war, right, you end up with a lot of widows who were inheriting entire fortunes from not only their own family, but their husband's family. And so within the early Christian period, in some cases, some of the wealthiest people in the Roman Empire are women. They are these widows who have inherited two vast family fortunes and consolidated them. Now, let's talk about school. The schools for the wealthiest people, they homeschooled. In other words, what that means is they hired private tutors to come into their homes and educate their children. And others who could afford it sent their children to schools. The daughters of the social classes who could afford education were able to receive an education if their parents chose to hire a tutor for them or send them to school. They tended not to do that as often as the boys, but there was nothing stopping them if they wanted to pay for it. There were also, for the children who were sent to school, there were also these tutors. And there isn't a perfect English translation of the Greek word for this, but parents would sometimes hire these tutors to accompany, especially a boy usually, make sure they get to school, make sure they get home, make sure they do their homework. But it went farther than that. It went beyond that. And often these tutors were even expected to be kind of mentor to the boys, which included, how can I put this delicately, which included mentoring young boys in their sexuality. We would look at that now and say these were sexual predators who were sexually abusing boys for a living and getting paid for it by the boys' parents, which is why, as you can see, the early Christians not only didn't practice this, but spoke out against it. And so this was one of several ways in which sexual abuse was built into the very structure of Roman culture and into the expectations, especially for the upper classes, of what it meant to become a man. All right, now, assuming children went to school, many children didn't, of course, and many children would have learned the trade of one of their parents. But for those children who went to school, they had, sort of like we do, 3 phases of school. They had something like grade school or grammar school, which was all about learning languages and reading literature, reading the sort of historic, poetic literature of Greece and Rome, right? And then after that, if the child went on to school, and usually, again, this was for boys, he went to a school of rhetoric, which is sort of like our high school, I guess. And there they would learn the art of conversation, argumentation, and speech making, and trying to convince people to come over to your side. And this is a skill that the Romans valued very highly, because if you went to court in Roman culture, the winner of a court case is not necessarily the one who has truth on their side. The winner of the court case is the one whose lawyer is most convincing and gets the most applause from the audience who's gathered there to hear the speeches that the lawyers make. So it's kind of like, imagine if all of our high school students had to study apologetics and go to Toastmasters or something. Now, those who went on from there would go to something analogous to college, but they didn't really have university. That wasn't invented for another 1,000 years. But if they went on to a regional school, it was generally with the assumption that they were then going to go on to be a teacher and teach either languages and literature or rhetoric, right? Now, there were also schools for adults, which means schools of philosophy. And Rome itself became a headquarters for teachers of philosophy who came from all over the empire, hoping to set up shop, hang a shingle, and open a school of philosophy, teaching their brand of philosophy. Eventually, teachers of Gnosticism and other kinds of, esoteric cults would also come to Rome and try to set up a school. Alexandria in Egypt was another place where it was kind of a mecca for all of these teachers of philosophy and Gnosticism and things like that. And sometimes the Roman government would actually crack down on some of these teachers and kick them out of Rome because they became too numerous and kind of a nuisance. And for example, in 139 BCE, the Roman Senate kicked all the astrologers out of Rome, right? And that will happen every once in a while. They'll get annoyed with the cult of Isis and kick those guys out of Rome or whatever. So we're not really going to talk in this course in any detail about philosophy. That would be another whole course in itself. And of course, obviously, if you want to find out more about philosophy, I encourage you to explore that on your own. But what you need to know for this course is that when it comes to philosophy, it was Stoicism that had the most influence on Roman culture and somewhat on Christianity as well, right? Except, to be clear, the early Christians were discerning when it came to choosing what aspects they would sort of resonate with in terms of Greco-Roman philosophy and which aspects of philosophy they would leave by the wayside. And in general, the criterion for that was if an aspect of Greco-Roman philosophy was consistent with Hebrew wisdom, then they might pick up on that aspect of philosophy and use it to help them explain the theology that comes out of Judaism. But if an aspect of Greco-Roman theology or Greco-Roman philosophy is not consistent with Hebrew theology and Hebrew wisdom, then they would have no problem just rejecting it. Now, outside of Rome, you have two different kinds of association with the Roman Empire. There are colonies and there are client kingdoms. And I'm not talking about enemies, obviously, that's a different thing. But in terms of friends and allies, you have two different kinds of association with the Roman Empire. Colonies are conquered nations or regions, and they have been annexed to the Roman Empire. So they are part of the Roman Empire, but they're considered colonies, so they are subject to taxes. They are ruled by Romans who are sent out to the colony to rule there. And they are subject to the conscription of soldiers for what are called auxiliary legions. So the main legions of Rome are made up of soldiers from Italy, but the auxiliary legions are made up of soldiers from the colonies, locals who are conscripted to help defend their regions from the enemies farther out. Well, then you also have client kingdoms. And a client kingdom is technically an independent kingdom or nation ruled by a local king, ruled by one of their people. But they are, of course, expected to be an ally with Rome at all times. So the deal is, and of course this is absolutely not a contract of equal parties, right? Obviously, Rome is the more powerful party, and hanging over the head of a client kingdom at all times is the reality that Rome could make them a colony anytime they want to. So the deal is with a client kingdom is that the client kingdom supports Rome in all its wars, and they will fight on the side of Rome, and they will never fight against Rome. And then in return, Rome will protect them if they ever need friends in high places, if they ever need, the big brother to protect them from the bully. Rome will be there. That's the deal. And so this is going to become important when we talk about Judea and Galilee and what's going on there, right? Okay. Now, in the year 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey went to the eastern shore of the Mediterranean and conquered everything that we might call the Holy Land. And at this time, Judea became a Roman colony. Now, later, it is going to be, for a window of time, it's going to be a client kingdom with its own king, right? Remember King Herod? We'll get there. But in fact, Octavian will make Herod the king as a reward for Herod's people supporting his great-uncle Julius Caesar in the civil wars that led up to Julius Caesar claiming for himself the title of dictator. And so because the Judeans gave support to great-uncle Julius, Octavian will make Herod king of Judea. So this is why Herod the First is called king of Judea. And it will be a client kingdom with a certain amount of independence, but then that's going to go bad, and then it will be a colony again. So let me say a little bit more about colonies, and then we'll move on. Colonies are governed by senators, which is to say, these are men of senatorial rank who have had a career in the Senate. They've rotated through as consul, right? But now they're retiring from the Senate, and they would be sent out to govern the colonies. Now, you have to remember that being a politician back then was not a day job with a paycheck. Senators did not get paid for being senators. Senators had to pay to be senators. It cost them a lot of money. Not only did they have to pay to build buildings, and they were expected to sponsor games and shows, but there were all kinds of things that senators had to pay for, sometimes even roads and things, in order to remain in the Senate. So it was actually very expensive to be a senator, which is why all the senators are wealthy. If you were to ask a Roman, how come all your senators are from the wealthiest classes? They would say, well, duh, it's because it costs a lot of money to be a senator. Only a wealthy person can be a senator. But then they would say something like, but it's okay because we know wealthy people are always honest because they have no reason to lie or cheat or be greedy because they're already rich. So why would they ever do that? So it's a good thing we can trust the rich to always be honest. They actually said things like that. Well, anyway, the point is that after a career in the Senate, some senators were broke. And so they would request, or they would get appointed to be the governor of a province. Now, the actual title for the governor of a province was a proconsul, meaning like someone for the consul. But in reality, he's kind of an ex-consul or a retired senator who goes out to be the governor of a province. And so when you're reading scripture and you see the term governor, that is a proconsul. And then what these guys did is they served as proconsul in a colony for a few years so they could skim the taxes, rebuild their wealth, and then they could actually retire. So a proconsul usually had an assistant called a quaestor, who was his manager. And part of the job of the quaestor was to collect the taxes. The quaestor would hire publicani, or in English, publicans, and these are the tax collectors. But these are locals. So the quaestor is going out and hiring locals who are willing, for the paycheck, to basically betray their own people and collect taxes for the Romans. And this is why everybody hates tax collectors. Not to mention the fact that the tax collectors basically would increase the taxes so that they could keep some. And so when the tax collector came to your house and said, here's how much you owe, you never really knew how much you actually owed the Romans because the price was always jacked up so that the tax collector would take his cut. Now, Pontius Pilate may have been a quaestor, but more likely he held a different title, which was that of procurator. A procurator is a financial administrator. It's also sometimes called a prefect. And in the case of Pontius Pilate, because he was in Judea, and because Judea was considered relatively insignificant, Judea, even when it was a colony, never actually had its own proconsul. And so Pontius Pilate held this office of procurator, which was basically kind of an assistant proconsul or a stand-in for the proconsul, and he was given the charge to be the authority in Judea, which meant that even though a procurator would not usually have military authority, Pontius Pilate was given authority over the legions in Judea. He was also given authority over collecting the taxes, which assumes that he would have to hire the publicani, or perhaps he had a quaestor who hired the publicani. But the point is that Pontius Pilate held this office not as governor, because he was not a senator, he was not a proconsul. And so if you see a Bible translation that calls Pilate governor, he was not governor, he was probably a procurator. And his headquarters was in the port city of Caesarea by the sea, because that's where the port was. And whatever port there was that was closer to Jerusalem was not deep enough for the big Roman ships. And so Caesarea was the port where the Romans came in and out of. And so that's where Pontius Pilate's headquarters was. and he would only come to Jerusalem when he had to, when perhaps he thought trouble was likely, like at the high holidays. And so when he was in Jerusalem, at those times, he would make his headquarters in Herod's old palace, which the Romans referred to as the Praetorium. And you will sometimes see in the biblical text Herod's old palace in Jerusalem, where Pontius Pilate is making his temporary headquarters. You will see that referred to as the Praetorium. But that's just because the Romans called it that, because they were naming it after the headquarters of the Praetorian Guard in Rome, and it was just kind of a convention. So when Pontius Pilate is not in Jerusalem, there is a military tribune, the tribune of the Jerusalem cohort, who acted kind of like the chief of police in Jerusalem. And between the procurators and the tribunes, they gradually eroded away any civic powers that the Sanhedrin had. And so the Jewish High Council, the Sanhedrin, was losing all of its authority in Jerusalem as it was picked up by the Romans. But what you have to understand is that the office of high priest is something that by this time is bought and paid for by a collaborator with the Romans, right? And so when you read in the text of Scripture that Caiaphas is the high priest, by rights, a high priest is only supposed to be high priest for 1 year. That's their term of service. And then someone else takes over that job. But Caiaphas was high priest from the year 26 AD or CE to the year 36 AD for 10 years. Why was Caiaphas high priest for 10 years when he shouldn't be? Guess what years Pontius Pilate was in office as procurator? 26 to 36, the exact same time. So that tells you that the high priest Caiaphas is in cahoots with Pilate. He has paid for that office. As long as he keeps paying for it, he gets to keep it. And as soon as Pontius Pilate is recalled in disgrace back to Rome, guess who else is out of work? Caiaphas. So that office is, and everybody knows it, it is an office that's held by someone who's willing to collaborate with the Romans. In fact, if you remember Jesus' parable of the rich man and Lazarus, in that parable, Jesus makes a point to comment that the rich man wore purple. The color purple is an indication of the highest social classes and even of royalty in some cultures, right? And so to make this comment that the rich man wore purple, the subtext there is probably that Jesus is criticizing those Pharisees and probably the high priest who have taken to wearing purple because that designates a rank in society that they have received permission to wear from the Romans. So, the critique there is that these Pharisees care more about their status in society than about the poor. And that's part of the subtext in that whole parable of the rich man and Lazarus. All right, so just to finish the story of the emergence of the empire, Octavian, great-nephew and heir of Julius Caesar, did the one thing that his uncle Julius was not willing to do, which is that when the civil wars were over, he relinquished his powers as the sole ruler and gave his powers back to the Senate. The Senate responded by essentially just giving the powers right back to him. And the Senate gave him a new name, Augustus, which means, in a Roman context, it means pious or religious, but in the Roman context, it means that in a pagan sense. But the point is that it did leave Octavian Augustus now as the head senator and commander-in-chief of all the legions for life. And this was in 27 BC or BCE. And so perhaps some scholars will date the end of the Republic and the beginning of the empire to this year, 27. But you see what's going on. Now, Augustus, as the first emperor of the Roman Empire instituted a lot of things that made the Roman Empire what it was. And the only thing I'll mention right now is something called the Cursus Publicus, which was a network of transportation, almost kind of like a Pony Express. You could take horses from one city to the next and then immediately switch up for horses that weren't tired and keep going. And this allowed politicians and other agents of the government to travel relatively quickly across the empire. Now, this is important for us because later, when the Emperor Constantine gives certain civil authorities to Christian bishops, right? One of the things that Constantine will allow Christian bishops to do is to use this cursus publicus. They are now allowed to use the government transportation system. I'm getting ahead of myself. This is in the 4th century, and there are going to be people who complain about it. There will be politicians who will say things like, "I can't even get a wagon because every wagon is full of bishops." But the reason that's important is because this will allow the church to have regional and worldwide councils of bishops. Again, we'll get there when we get there, but it's important to understand this, right? Interestingly, another thing that Augustus did was to put a stop to the expansion of colonization because he realized it was not cost effective, that it was too expensive to conquer and annex another region just for whatever resources they might get from it. Now, sadly, one of the main resources that Rome had been getting from colonization was slaves. But it was getting to the point where there weren't enough people to enslave anymore, and there's also this underlying fear that there's really so many slaves now that if they ever decide to revolt, it's going to be a problem. In fact, if you've ever seen Spartacus, you know that they did on occasion. And so, at any rate, we'll have more to say about slavery later in the course, for sure. But the point is that for a while, Augustus put a stop to the expansion of colonization. And it's going to start up again. But some scholars would say that it's during that window of time when there was no colonization that the Roman Empire was at its peak and thrived, right? And if you were to talk about reasons why the Roman Empire is going to fall, and especially I'm thinking about in the West, one of the things you would have to put on that list is its expansion. Because when colonization is fired up again, right, the emperors are going to try to expand the borders of Rome so far that they won't be able to sustain them. And you'll see how that plays out later in the course. Okay, so in 12 BC, Augustus was named Pontifex Maximus, which is a term you may have heard. It's Latin for the highest or greatest priest, except that the word pontifex in Latin actually means literally bridge builder, pontifex, the maker of bridges, right? And so the priests are seen as bridge builders between the human and the divine. And that's something Christians could agree with, right? And so we'll see that play out too. But for now, Augustus is named basically the head priest of all the religions of Rome. And in 2 BC, he was named by the Senate Pater Patriae, the father of the country. And it was right about at that time that Jesus was born. And so Jesus was born on December 25th in the year 1 AD, right? Well, slow down. There's two things going on there. There's a date and there's a year. With regard to the date, I would just encourage people to watch my video on whether the dates for Christian holidays are based on pagan holidays. Spoiler alert, they are not. But the short version of the story is that the reason we celebrate Jesus' birth on December 25th is because the early Christians believed Jesus had died on March 25th. They had calculated that the actual Good Friday on which Jesus was crucified was March 25th. Now, before you start Googling what day of the week was March 25th in the year X whatever AD, right? It's not going to work out because there's all kinds of glitches in the calendar. And as we're going to hear, even our calendar is off. And, the Romans, they knew that a year lasted 365 and 1/4 days. But instead of adding 1 day every 4 years as a leap year, they would basically just wait a century and then add a month or some weird thing. And so just do these crazy things to catch up. And months get added and months get subtracted. And so you pretty much have to have a PhD in calendar to figure all this out. But trust me when I say that at least the early Christians believed that Jesus was crucified on March 25th. Now, there is a tradition in Jewish writings that Moses died on his birthday. Why? Because a man who so perfectly followed and fulfilled the will of God would have a life that was perfectly fulfilled, perfectly rounded out, and he would die on his birthday. Except Moses wasn't perfect, right? Jesus is perfect. Jesus is the prophet like Moses, but better. So the early Christians reasoned that Jesus didn't just die on his birthday, he died on the day he was conceived. The day he was conceived, the date on which the Word became flesh. And when is that? Well, that's the Feast of the Annunciation. The Annunciation is when the angel came to Mary, and we see this in Luke chapter 2, and the angel says to Mary, Mary, assuming you agree to this, assuming you say yes, you're going to be with child. Not sometime in the future, but today. So, the Feast of the Annunciation is the date on which Jesus was conceived, which, by the logic of the early church, must also be the date on which he died, March 25th. So if Jesus was conceived on March 25th, being the perfect son that he is, he couldn't have anything but a perfect 9-month pregnancy. So therefore, do the math. Exactly 9 months from March 25th gives you December 25th. That's why we celebrate Jesus' birth on December 25th, and that's what the early church did. Now later, there were some Eastern Christians who did the math differently, and decided that Jesus was crucified on April 6th, and then they did the same 9-month addition, and they got January 6th for the birth of Jesus, which is why some of our Eastern brothers and sisters celebrate the birth of Christ on what we call Epiphany, January 6th. But anyway, that's how we got the date. As far as the year, right? As far as the year, there is a problem with our calendars. Our calendars are, of course, meant to be written so that whatever this is the year of our Lord, 2024. That's meant to imply that it is now 2024 years after the birth of Christ. Except that there was a mistake made when all this was put together, and we are at least 4 years off. And we know this from multiple sources, including the Gospels. And I'll just say up front that if anyone tells you that you can't trust the Gospels for some of these details, it's not the Gospels that are wrong, it's the calendar that's wrong. The Gospels are actually right as long as you understand them correctly. And so, as we read in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus was born during the reign of Herod I, this king of the now client kingdom Judea. He's been made king by the Roman emperor, and during his reign, Jesus is born. But we also know that Herod I died in 4 BC. So that means Jesus has to be born before 4 BC. And this is part of the reason why we know that our calendars are off by at least 4 years. Now, in Luke, we have something called the Quirinius problem. Quirinius became the proconsul in Syria in 6 AD. And that's because of, multiple factors. But in 6 AD, right, Herod had been dead for 10 years now. His son Archelaus was ruling in his place, And you remember the text from the Gospels. They went to Egypt. They're on their way back from Egypt. But they hear Archelaus is ruling and he's worse than his father. Well, the Romans thought so too. And so Augustus eventually deposed Archelaus. And instead of putting a different king on the throne of a client kingdom, now Judea becomes a colony. But because Judea is still seen as insignificant, it's not really a colony on its own with its own proconsul. It gets annexed to the colony of Syria under the authority of the proconsul in Syria, who is the newly appointed Quirinius. Now, obviously, at this point, new proconsul, annexed colony, they're going to have a census, and they're going to count heads to estimate their taxes. But what Luke says in Luke 2, verse 2, is not that the census that brought Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem was the census under Quirinius. Luke actually says in the Greek that this census was before Quirinius was governing Syria. So in other words, what Luke is actually saying in 2:2 is, you remember that big census we had when Quirinius became governor of Syria and Judea, lost its status as a client kingdom and became a colony and got annexed to Syria. Oh, and remember how everybody was so upset by the taxation and that party of the Zealots was formed out of a quasi-rebellion at this time? Remember all that drama? Well, this census, the one that brought Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem, was not that census. It was before that census. What Luke 2:2 actually says in the Greek is, this census was before Quirinius was governing Syria, right? And if you want the background on this, check out my book, Reading the Church Fathers. In the chapter on the New Testament, I've got a whole section on the Quirinius problem. So all that is to say that Quirinius is not a problem for the dating of Jesus' birth. He is born within the reign of Herod I, and so he must have been born before 4 BC or BCE. And he was probably born not right before, because Herod would then have to find out about it and attempt to kill him by killing the babies in Bethlehem and all of that. And so most likely Jesus was born in what by our calendar would be 6 or 5 BC. And there are studies that have been done on astronomical phenomena to see if people saw any special stars during that time. And there are several theories about that are fun to look up, but it seems pretty clear that there was enough going on in the sky that if you want to, you can find evidence of the Star of Bethlehem actually occurring, seen by people who were looking. And so let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Jesus was born in about 5 BCE. Okay, that's the end of part 1. Next up, I'm going to do a sort of chronological overview of the Roman emperors and what was going on in the Roman Empire throughout the first century and the writing of the New Testament. See you next time.